Thank you. I'm a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and also the National Labor Relations Board. I'm here in my personal capacity. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was established pursuant to the 1957 Civil Rights Act to, among other things, act as a national clearinghouse for matters pertaining to equal protection and voting rights. In furtherance of the clearinghouse function, the Commission on a regular basis conducts hearings on voter suppression, intimidation, and harassment. And the last such hearing was in October of 2006, just before the midterm elections. Based on the evidence adduced at that Commission hearing, I would urge the Commission in its deliberations of Senate Bill 453 to consider at least 3 deceptive practices not currently covered by the bill. That is, false registrations, multiple registrations, and compromised absentee ballots. The evidence adduced shows there are at least 2 prongs with the problem of deceptive practices that deal with election integrity. First is voter suppression broadly defined. Second is voter fraud. The empirical evidence shows that the first prong is generally a function of voter or provisional ballots and also of election disinformation. Sections 3.2 A2, Romanet 1, and 3B1.2, Romanet 2 cover at least certain elements of the first prong, that is, preventing eligible voters from voting, but leave wholly unaddressed the second prong of affirmative voter fraud. In deceptive practice, at least as consequential as voter suppression and intimidation, and possibly more so. For example, in the 2000 presidential election, there were voluminous claims of rampant voter intimidation, harassment, and suppression. The Civil Rights Commission conducted a 6-month investigation immediately after the election. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice also conducted an investigation. Despite the widespread claims of intimidation, harassment, suppression, the investigation yielded just 2 ostensible cases of perceived voter intimidation. And the Civil Rights Division's investigation concluded that there was no credible evidence of any Floridians having their votes intentionally denied. Now, in contrast, a subsequent media investigation showed that there were at least 2,000 ballots cast illegally in Florida, and since the vote margin was 537 votes, the fraudulent votes were sufficient to affect the outcome of the election. This is not an isolated occurrence. The evidence adduced at Commission hearings shows that, and particularly from Mark Hearn, who is an advisor to the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform, shows that there are numerous instances, suggests there are numerous instances of significant voter fraud. The allegations include individuals and organizations that aid and abet ineligible voters to vote. Now, there are numerous cases that have been reported of people paid to register those ineligible to vote and fictitious characters. The infamous case in Ohio during the 2000 presidential election campaign of a canvasser paid with crack cocaine to register Dick Tracy, Mary Poppins, and scores of other equally notable voters is fairly well known. Again, these are not isolated circumstances. In 2001, a major voter registration drive in the black community of St. Louis produced 3,800 new voter registration cards. When some of the names appeared suspicious, elections officials reviewed all of the cards and determined that nearly every single one was fraudulent. Dogs, the dead, and people who simply didn't want to register to vote were among the new registrants. Now, the problem is not simply that canvassers are being paid to register manifestly fraudulent voters, it's that voting rolls throughout the country are being padded with perhaps hundreds of thousands of false and fraudulent names. Testimony before the Senate Rules Committee by John Sample showed that Alaska, for example, has 503,000 people on the voting rolls, yet there are only 437,000 people of voting age in Alaska. The problem is magnified by those who solicit and aid individuals to vote in multiple jurisdictions. 140,000 Floridians are registered in multiple jurisdictions. 60,000 voters are registered in both North Carolina and South Carolina. 8,000 Kentuckians are registered in Tennessee. The bill is silent with respect to these deceptive practices, and multiple registrations, fraudulent registrations, are compounded by the problem of compromised absentee ballot integrity. The practice of misleadingly assisting individuals to cast an absentee ballot can lead to wholesale disenfranchisement. This is a potential troublesome problem, particularly with respect to bilingual ballots. This is not a minor concern. The 1998 Miami mayoral election was actually set aside because of rampant absentee ballot forgeries. These deceptive practices have the capacity to affect the outcome of an election. They undermine public confidence in the electoral process. And the bill is silent on these. These are significant omissions. So I would urge this committee to consider including these deceptive practices in the bill's prohibitions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.